Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2023 Education Law and Policy Conference. Just a couple quick housekeeping announcements before we get started. If you're earning CLE credit today, please be sure to check in by scanning the QR code on the back of your program right before we get started to make sure you get credit. Also, our Wi-Fi password is ELP23, all lowercase. So like Education Law and Policy Conference. And to officially kick things off, it's my pleasure to introduce Bob Eitel, the president and co-founder of the Defense of Freedom Institute.
Good morning, I'm Bob Eitel. As Angela said, I am president of DFI, and it's my privilege to welcome you to the 2023 Education Law and Policy Conference. Before I get into some observations about the state of American education, I wanted to be sure to thank Gene Meyer and Dean Reuter and the Federal Society for their partnership in this conference. We could not have done this without them. They're professionals at this sort of thing, as many as you know. We greatly appreciate their recognition that today's discussions will contribute to the ongoing legal and policy debates over the future of law and education in the United States. And for this, I'm personally grateful, Dean. Before we hear from our opening speaker, I'd like to offer a few basic observations about the state of American education to sort of set the table for today's conversations. At the risk of sounding obvious, I think that we can all agree that our education system, from kindergarten through higher education, is in crisis. In higher education, things are greatly amiss. The illiberal takeover of higher ed continues, with progressive orthodoxies becoming embedded in many university, college, and law schools. More distressingly, law schools have embraced this progressive orthodoxy with vigor, and law schools of all institutions in the education sector should know better. Cancel culture has free reign in too many of our schools. One need look no further than Stanford Law School earlier this year and its mistreatment of Fifth Circuit Judge Kyle Duncan when he attempted to give a talk during a Federalist Society student chapter event and was shouted down in protest by the students in an effort organized by a law school dean at the school. Let our friend Ilya Shapiro, who is one of our panelists today, tell you about his personal experience with cancel culture in a local law school. Adding to these concerns is the continued push by institutional accreditation agencies and professional organizations like the American Bar Association to impose, as a condition of accreditation or program recognition, DEI requirements for faculty, hiring, and admissions at colleges, universities, and law schools. Unfortunately, most institutions and programs eagerly accept these conditions. We could also talk about federal student loans. The federal student loan program is in terrible condition, and recent events have shown that the federal government simply cannot manage such a massive program. Indeed, while it stares down a $33 trillion national debt, the federal government continues to fund a system of financial aid with no underwriting, a system racked by mismanagement, excessive loan relief policies, and complicated repayment programs. The loan program is slowly mutating into a grant program before our very eyes. And while all this occurs, the cost of college continues to skyrocket. There have been some bright spots, I'll admit that. The Supreme Court decision in Nebraska v. Biden earlier this year put an end to the Education Department's lawless student loan mass forgiveness program. And I think we could all be encouraged by the Students for Fair Admissions cases, which put an end to the use of race in higher education admissions. But President Biden and his administration have made it very clear that they intend to work around these decisions through a combination of rulemaking and administrative guidance. These victories are significant, but but there's a lot more fighting to do in these areas. Perhaps even of greater concern than higher ed is the state of public K-12 education in the United States. I could point to any number of issues there. We could discuss federal and state efforts to suppress parents' rights, to insert school district bureaucracies between parent and child on controversial issues relating to a host of issues, not the least of which are those that relate to gender identity. Indeed, many school districts and even states, California as a recent example, have taken an active role in prohibiting schools from informing parents about school policies and practices concerning issues relating to gender identity. We could talk about the administration's proposed Title IX rule, which threatens women's and girls' sports, living facilities, and private spaces, undercuts campus due process and free speech, and will only add to the massive DEI bureaucracies that weigh down our educational institutions in both K-12 and higher ed. I could point to the fact that states and school districts have received nearly $200 billion in federal COVID relief for K-12 schools. This amount is the largest federal infusion ever provided to public education in the history of the United States. It's almost 5 times as large as total federal K-12 spending in 2019 to 20. Put it in more historical terms, in today's dollars, as estimated by the Brookings Institution, by point of comparison, the Manhattan Project cost $20 billion. The Congressional Research Service estimates that the United States paid $334 billion to fight and win the First World War. I could go on, but you get the gist. $200 billion is a massive amount of funding. But despite this funding, students since the pandemic have continued to experience massive learning loss, plummeting test scores, and chronic absenteeism. The truth is, things weren't all that great before the pandemic. We all know that NAEP scores were already plummeting. ACT and SAT scores were already declining. Students were trapped in woefully inadequate public schools simply because they lived in the wrong zip code. By the time of the pandemic, many school systems had already incorporated the gender identity and critical race theory ideas that are so controversial in their curricula. Virtual learning during COVID simply uncovered something that had been happening for years. Let me also remind you about another thing, and that is teacher strikes before the pandemic were at an all-time high. Do you remember Red for Ed teacher strikes, 2017, 18, 19, Arizona, Ohio, West Virginia, these mysterious actions occurring with the teacher workforces in each of these states, supposedly red states, all coordinated by apparently teacher unions. There were 497 teacher strikes from 2017 to 19. In the 10 years before that, there were 203 strikes. For this period from 2007 to 2019, in which there were 700 strikes, one researcher has estimated that there were 63 million student days with no learning. The fact of the matter is that learning loss and plummeting test scores and absenteeism were a problem before the pandemic. Clearly, the kids are not all right, and in fact, they haven't been for quite some time. So one has to ask, how could public education in the United States reach this point? Why hasn't public education been reformed? Where is the accountability? To address this question and more, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Philip K. Howard, to give the conference's opening remarks. Philip has become well known over the years for his creative and innovative thinking, and he is probably, in my opinion, one of the few American public intellectuals who can genuinely lay claim to having original ideas. He is the best-selling author of The Death of Common Sense, The Collapse of the Common Good, The Rule of Nobody, Try Common Sense, and my personal favorite, notwithstanding the chosen profession for many of us in this room, Life Without Lawyers. His latest book, Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions, is excellent. I've read it. I strongly recommend that you do. Phil is a graduate of Yale College and the University of Virginia Law School. He is senior counsel at the law firm of Covington and Burling and chairs Common Good, a nonpartisan coalition dedicated to simplifying laws so that Americans can use common sense in their daily lives. We are delighted to have him. And Mr. Howard, you have the broom.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for coming here. This is an important audience to me because I need help in formulating what I'm going to talk about this morning. There are a number of people who helped me with writing Not Accountable who are here. My colleague Donna Thompson from Common Good, Michael Hartney is going to speak later. Federalist Society has been supported throughout my crusade, even though I'm a kind of absentee intellectual up in New York, where people care more about money. So I'm going to try to convince you to look at public employee unions through a different lens than we're used to looking at them through. I'd like to look at them through the lens of democratic governance instead of just inefficiency or annoyance or all the other sort of terrible things that they've put upon society. And this is a relatively new problem. 50 years ago, almost without anyone noticing and for no good reason, public employee unions were given collective bargaining powers by the federal government and by 38 states. The scope of these bargaining agreements varies somewhat from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but the basic idea is that elected executives now had a legal obligation to make a deal with the unions on the terms and conditions of employment, especially in schools, which are there are something like 7 million members of public employee unions in this country, of which 4.5 million are members of the teachers' unions. Until the 1960s, the collective wisdom was that collective bargaining in the trade union context could not be transplanted to the public sector, to quote FDR. That was for two reasons. One is that public employees were thought to have a fiduciary duty to serve the public, not bargain against the public. So, for example, Samuel Gompers refused to let police join the AFL because it would be a conflict of interest back in the early days of the labor movement. Another reason is that public employee unions, unlike trade unions, don't have market constraints on how much they can bargain for. If a trade union bargains for inefficient work rules, the members of the union will soon find that they no longer have a job because the business will move out of town or go out of business. Government can't move out of town or go out of business. So there is no constraint. There's only a political constraint to what the unions can bargain for. But in the 1960s, all these reasons were forgotten in the heyday of the rights revolution, and the unions had been angling for power for decades, public employee unions, and this was their moment. They found some pliable public leaders, starting most notably with JFK, and got experts to say it's just a matter of elementary fairness to allow public employees to have collective bargaining power similar to that of trade unions. So for 50 years, every 3 or 4 years, in all these jurisdictions, they've negotiated new agreements, other controls, entitlements, and such. And the bottom line here is that elected executives have lost the authority to run the operating machinery of government. Through a collection of multi-hundred-page agreements, which have two main pernicious effects relating to management. One is that there's near zero accountability in the public sector. One 18-year study in Illinois found that an average of 2 out of 95,000 teachers were dismissed for performance each year. That's at 0.002%. That's actually double the rate as in California. The harm of no accountability is not just that there are some bad teachers, and there are, is that without accountability, there's no mutual trust in an organization. So the sense of commitment to others, the energy, the idea of pride in the emotional commitment required in an organization tends to disappear, like letting the air out of the balloon when everyone knows that performance doesn't matter. It's almost impossible to run a good organization when people know that performance doesn't matter. There's a lot of psychological literature on this, and that's what's happened because of the absence of accountability. The second thing that happened was that daily management decisions became increasingly constrained by rigid work rules, by compliance, and by abilities to grieve anything that someone doesn't like, so that over these 50 years, you've had an accumulation, like sediment in the harbor, of these controls. We all know what they all are. Michael Hartney is here, details a number of those in his book. Terry Moe in his book, Special Interest, also details them. But for example, seniority, all decisions, priority layoffs, that all go by seniority. That might be fine for an assembly line, but schools are not assembly lines. So there are these periodic reports of teachers who are the teacher of the year in some state getting laid off because she doesn't have seniority. Restrictions on class size. It sounds so virtuous, but you have to make trade-offs in running a school, where the resources go. And so, for example, Success Academy, a charter school that's quite successful in New York, have larger class sizes so that they can devote resources to things like art and music that will interest and inspire the children to life. So there are all these trade-offs. You have these rigid rules on class size that you can't do anything. The principal's authority over teachers. For example, principal in most agreements can't visit to observe a teacher's performance without advance notice. Strict limits on extra duties. There is no lunch duty. You do not have to go supervise the playground, that sort of thing. What's the effect of that? The effect of that is chaos in the lunchroom and the restriction of outdoor activities that boys especially need to keep them focused. They need to go run around. Sick days are now entitlements. Bob just referred to the number of sick days. In Seattle, they found that 9% of the total workforce of the teachers was spent in sick days, usually on a Friday or a Monday. And in Seattle, that was 56,000 days during a given year. During those days, the kids have a substitute teacher who knows nothing about the kids and is not teaching them anything specific. So that's a decline, effectively, of 9% of the educational output. The grievance, anytime you don't like something, any obnoxious teacher, any person who's failing, games the system through the grievance procedure, and the unions exist to make people feel important by devoting lawyers to doing this. So what happens is that running a school is not a matter of it's not actually trying to aspire to excellence. It's not trying to do what's needed for this kid. It's a job of compliance and mollifying the unions. And then if something unusual happens, say a pandemic, well, there's nothing in the contract about teaching during a pandemic. So all the other essential workers in the country are working in hospitals and emergency rooms, grocery stores, trash collection, not the teachers. They have a contract. Contract says what they have to do, and they don't have to work in a pandemic. Well, how about distance teaching? Sorry, the contract says nothing about that either, so that has to be negotiated. How is it negotiated? It was negotiated in many jurisdictions with 2 or 3 hours of work each day. That's what the unions got. And then, when vaccines came along, the teachers' union objected to going back to work because it would be unfair to require teachers to take a vaccine. No, that's their right not to take a vaccine and not to go back to work. I mean, the solipsism of these rules. I was in a podcast with Bob Schramm, who's a Democratic thought leader at USC, and he was saying, oh, but who's going to protect the rights of the teachers? And who's protecting the students? I mean, Bob, look what's happened. Look at the schools in California. They spend more than almost anybody, and they're at the bottom quartile. It's terrible. What about the future of these kids? He says, oh, but you've got to balance the interest. I said, Bob, give me one example of a provision in the 200-page Los Angeles Unified School District contract. One example of a provision that's good for the kids. Just give me one. He thought for a second. He said, smaller class size. I said, smaller class size. It's only coincidence that means you have to hire more teachers and there's less money for other things. Don't you have to balance those things out? And isn't class size one of the things that you're running a school system that you have to be able, one of the chips on the table that you work with? He had no answer. So you have these agreements, again, it's worth dwelling on this, where there's not one good thing for the public. They don't even attract teachers, because working in school, we have a daughter as a teacher, working in schools like this is horrible. It's horrible to work in a place without pride and energy. I mean, what's the point of being a teacher if not to make a difference in the lives of young people? So looking at this from the standpoint of democratic governance, the bottom line is that voters elect mayors and governors who have no authority to fix a broken school. They come to office, they're bound by the agreement entered into by their predecessor. They can't make any of these decisions. And then when the new agreement comes up for negotiation, in many jurisdictions, they have no authority to change it. Because if there's a disagreement over the provisions in the new agreement, a stalemate, it often gets decided by arbitrators elected by no one who have been approved by the unions. So you have a system, public schools are an arm of government. Democracy is about electing people to, especially executives, whose job is actually to run the operating machinery of government. And we elect people who have no authority to do anything. This year, 23 schools in Baltimore had not one student who was proficient in math, not one. And no one in Baltimore had the authority. What would you change? You would change everything in those schools. You would change the people, you would change the way they teach, you would change everything. No authority to do any of that. Chicago, 37 schools, not one student proficient in reading or math. So you have 37 schools where the kids don't have a chance. And we elect people every 4 years with slogans like change we can't believe in or drain the swamp or whatever, and nothing ever changes. Well, in the school's case, and in many operating, there's a reason for that. And the main reason, not the only reason, but it's the main reason, is that the unions have taken control of the operating machinery. So, so democracy can't work on these conditions. It just can't work. Literally. I mean, it's a matter of law, it can't work. So I decided to look at this through a constitutional lens. There's no clear line of constitutional cases that deals with the problem that I've addressed. So what I'm about to talk about is stepping into uncharted territory, but the factual case is unimpeachable. Democratic governance cannot function. This is not a question of sleazy politics. This is a question of legal impossibility. You can't actually run government, can't run schools. So the first principle I'd like you to think about is the non-delegation doctrine, not the non-delegation to agencies, but non-delegation by officials to private parties. So it's a long-standing first principle of constitutional governance coming out of John Locke's second treatise. To quote one Supreme Court opinion, "The power of governing is a trust committed by the people to the government, no part of which can be granted away." As part of the non-delegation doctrine, nor can any official or legislature impose limits and reduce the powers of the elected officials who come after them. So if you've got a constitutional responsibility, let's say to manage the operating system of government, you have to have the power to exercise that. It's the first principle now of our Constitution. Now this is actually explicitly incorporated for states and localities in the US Constitution in something called the Guarantee Clause in Article 4 of the Constitution, which provides that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a republican form of government. What that means, Madison talked about it a lot during the constitutional debates, is that people who, whatever form of government a state or city has, whoever is elected has to retain the power of governing so that they can be accountable to the people. They can't give it to any group of nobles or aristocracy or to any, quote, favored class. You have to retain the authority that the voters elected you for. Manifestly, what's happened with public unions, if they ceded that authority, both in terms of rigid rules that prevent management and in terms of veto powers, to the public unions. You know, the hurdle here is that the Supreme Court, in the few cases that have addressed the Guarantee Clause, have held that it's non-justiciable as a political question. So in the first case, Chief Justice Taney, Luther v. Borden in the mid-19th century, held that a dispute over which was the better form of constitution for the state of Rhode Island should be decided by the legislature, not by the Supreme Court, as to which one was more Republican than the other. And all those cases, I think, are rightly decided. But the question of whether a mayor or governor has the authority to exercise executive power does not involve a political judgment or a partisan choice about what's the best to do. It's a fundamental precept of our constitutional framework. There's no political question involved. It's a question of whether you're a Democrat or Republican or any other party, or whether when you're elected to run government, you have the authority to do that. And manifestly, we don't. So the first thing, which is contrary to the accepted wisdom of constitutional lawyers, is I think that there should be a claim probably brought by an elected executive, challenging the collective bargaining powers of unions in federal court under the Guarantee Clause of the Constitution. A second line of constitutional argument lies at the intersection of fiduciary duty, conflicts of interest, and political collusion. Public employees, unlike all other employees, unlike interest groups who give money to politicians and stuff, public employees have a duty to serve the public. In many positions, officials, perhaps teachers, certainly police, that duty is fiduciary in nature. You have to serve the public above your own, above your own interests. Unions and the union benefits over all these years, as I just described, are designed demonstrably to harm the public. We're not talking about negotiating for fair wages or safe working conditions. We're talking about agreements designed for inefficiency, designed to waste money and to put money in the pipe. Designed, I haven't talked about the pension abuses, designed to squander public resources in overtime games and other things, sick days, that harm the public. These provisions are directly contrary to the duty of the members of the union. They can't be reconciled. Under no reasonable, there's no reason, as Bob Strom and I argued, there's just no reasonable basis in which you can reconcile the idea that public employees have a duty to serve the public and the provisions they bargain for. They've used the power of collective bargaining to amass preemptive political power. About 10% of public employees belong to unions before the 1960s. It's now roughly a third. They collect over $5 billion a year in dues. If you examine what unions do with those dues, very little of it is services, such. Most of it is direct and indirect political activity. And I go through that in Non-Accountable. There's these incredible studies of, busloads of paid union members manning the phone banks and going door to door and stuff. They're an unbelievable machine. They are the spoils system reincarnate. It's an organized system designed for their own power in running the government and using public funds. So they get, in the case of the governor of New Jersey, spend tens of billions of dollars to get the governor elected. And then the collective bargaining agreement comes up. The governor knew that he has a legal obligation to make a deal with them. So it's unlike a special interest group who's giving money in the hopes of an open door and getting favors. In the case of these contributions, they're going to people who already have a legal obligation to make a deal. They're collecting tens of millions of dollars, and then they go to the bargaining table. Are they sitting across the table? No. They're sitting on the same side of the table. It's not a negotiation, it's a payoff. There's no reasonable, no reason. They say it on the websites. They say, we elect our own bosses. That's what the union websites say. So here you have a situation that is corrupt. It's a breach of duty 2 times over by public employees and then by the elected officials taking the money. And it's all designed for things that demonstrably harm the government. This is reaching much further than the guarantee clause. But if you look at equal protection jurisprudence and concepts such as fundamental rights, and is it a fundamental right of citizens to elect people who actually haven't been bought off in advance by people who have a conflict of interest to serve the public? Is there any compelling state interest for any of these agreements that I've described? No. I don't even think the agreements could pass a rational basis test. The slimmest of all the standards under the Equal Protection Clause. So something needs to be created there. I need help doing this. There are many ways to skin this cat, but the solution is clearly not political. The people we elect, what gave the legislature, the unions argue that, well, all these things were given by democratic processes. Legislature passed these laws, they passed all these controls, but what gives the legislature the power to take away the constitutional authority of an executive? Even if it were democratic, as it was, democratic, notwithstanding the conflict of interest, legislatures can't take away executive power. In the federal context and in many states' context, the law on that's absolutely clear. There are limits to what a legislature can do. So we need to construct the cases, bring the cases in the states where the situation is worst, which is a number of states, California, Illinois, New York, others, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, I'd like to close by just talking about one thing that's stepping back one. There's a presumption in these agreements and in the legalizing, what I'll call, of schools, legal controls over schools. There's a presumption that somehow schools can be organized like an assembly line. That you have rights, you have procedures, you have controls, you have work rules, that everything's gonna kind of work together, and it's all, people in the same uniforms will produce really brilliant, excited students. That's not what schools are. Schools are profoundly human, individualistic enterprises. There's this great book written by Philip Jackson and colleagues at the University of Chicago called The Moral Life of Schools, where they sat for weeks in classrooms and looked at the judgments made by teachers and evaluated what made the teacher effective or ineffective. So what do all great teachers have in common? Nothing. Nothing. It's all unique, just like we're all different. It's a function of their personality and their will and caring, and there are things they have in common, but they're just completely different from each other. And so the inspiration, energy, caring, adaptability, all the things that make a classroom come alive and make a school come alive are incredibly personal. None of them have anything to do with following rules or objective evidence, objective proof. You find any good school, including a good public school with lots of rules and unions, what will it have? It will have a culture where they don't follow the rules. It will have a culture where the leaders do what they think is right. They just ignore the rules. My daughter taught at a public school in Brooklyn, a very high-performing public school, where the principal on Friday afternoons would spend the afternoon filling out forms certifying that they had done things that they hadn't done. It was her way of rescuing the teachers from the bureaucratic constraints of the education department. And so all of these things, all the choices needed to create a great culture, to create a good school, to run a classroom, are based on perception and judgment and skill and all sorts of things, personality, but they're not objectifiable. They can only be systematized in a very broad way. If you don't leave room for spontaneity and exceptions and all that kind of stuff, nothing's going to work. And this entire system that we've laid on top of schools smothers the human spirit. It just can't, it can't work. I'm going to finish by reading a quote from the guy who used to run the KIPP School in Newark. I spent a lot of time there talking about the nature of choices and the way they run things there. We had a teacher here, a really nice guy with great credentials and several years of teaching under his belt, who just couldn't relate to the students. It's hard to put my finger on exactly why. He would blow a little hot and cold, letting one student get away with talking in class and then coming down hard on someone else who did the same thing. But the effect is that the kids started arguing back. It affected the whole school. Kids would come out of his classroom in a belligerent mood. We worked with him on classroom management the summer after his first year. It normally helps, but he just didn't have the knack. So we had to let him go. Those are the kinds of choices that need to be made every day in every school. And bureaucracy has been part of the problem, and Bob talked about this, but the unions have made it impossible to do this. We're creating generations of students stuck in public schools who, if they have a chance, it's because of their parents. It's not because of the schools. And in my view, it's unacceptable to tolerate it. We're killing the future of these children. And the solution isn't to make a deal with the unions. It isn't to, in my view, it's not even just political. We have to mount a frontal assault on the whole idea of an interest group, essentially a spoil system, that's taken control of this system in many of the states in this country. So I look forward to working with you in trying to do that over the next few years. Thank you. I could talk about my golf game. We have 15 minutes for questions. Any questions? Yes, yes, sir. There's a mic here thing.
Thank you. It's very interesting talk. I wonder if you can talk a bit more about the guarantee clause argument, because as I was trying to process what you're talking about, it seems as though if you look at a collective bargaining agreement as any other contract, certainly very comprehensive, but any other contract, all contracts have some would have some issue with this non-delegation doctrine, because you
Sure.
delegate to a contractor, this is how you
Sure.
perform this or that. So how is this different? And so I was wondering if you can walk through that.
Sure. So you have a contract to pave a road, right? To buy custodial services for a school, whatever. You can have a contract. That's fine. It's a limited delegation of it's providing a service by contract for the institution, accountable on whatever the terms of that contract are, right? And then able to be changed, at the term of the contract is over. What's different about the unions is it's not a contract to do something. It's a contract that removes all of the managerial authority of the person supposedly in charge of the schools. They have ceded the responsibility. And if you read Madison's description of what the guarantee was, that's exactly what you can't do. You can't, if your ultimate responsibility is to run a school, you can't actually give away that power. And in this case, they've given it away because of the terms of the agreement, more or less permanently. So it's, I suppose you could say it's a difference of degree. I think it's a difference in kind. Sure, you can go out and allocate here and there, there is no accountability. And also, if you just look at the details of it, what is the justification for a contract that makes it practically impossible to dismiss a teacher who is demonstrably inept? The terms of these procedures, Steve Brill writes about one, where an inept teacher, among other things, never graded papers. And the defense in the arbitration hearing was that the Department of Education couldn't come up with any written evidence instructing her to grade papers. So it's sophistry. If you think, so it's not, the proof's in the pudding. A public contract that was designed to be wasteful, you could probably attack as void if that were the purpose of it. If you entered into a contract with somebody to pave a road and it said, by the way, you don't really have to pave the road, we'll give you the money, and so there would be no public purpose for that, right? So you could challenge it. Well, that's essentially what's happened, except it's for the whole operation, all the operating machinery of government. You talk to the SES Association, Senior Executive Service here, they're my biggest supporters. They can't manage, it's not just a question of political people not being able to, the people who run these, the principals in the schools, the senior bureaucrats, they just don't have authority. So it's just a difference in effect.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. Very interesting talk. I apologize, I'm not quite as knowledgeable perhaps as some others as to how the education system, but where I grew up in Virginia, there was a very active school board.
Right.
Where do school boards fit in as a piece of practical leverage? And could you also make a couple of comments about what appears to be a revolution in Virginia towards the activities in the schools?
Right, right. Good question. Depending on the state, school boards have more or less authority. And so a school board could, for example, be a plaintiff in a constitutional challenge because it has executive authority in many places to run the school. Not a member of a school board, but a school board itself. The trend in the last 30 years has been that the public unions have taken control of the school boards. They have actually quite an active political, they have training academies training their members to run for school board elections, which are famously non-contested. You'll have some big district where it's won with 200 votes or something. So all you have to do is get the members to vote, members of the union to vote, and you get your, almost you get your person in. Michael Hartney, I think, writes about this in your book, right? And Michael's new book, which I recommend to you. So the school boards are, have become their own problem. Paul Hill is an education expert, has written about, the problems with school boards too. So there are complexity in the situation, but ultimately in a democracy, you do have to locate authority to run things someplace, and those people have to have the authority to take responsibility and make the decisions. I argue in Not Accountable that political organizing by public unions should be unconstitutional, that they should not be allowed to actually to harness the mass of big government, 22% of the workforce or something. No, 17% of the workforce works for government now. They shouldn't be able to harness the mass of big government to basically prevent the reform of government, which is what they've done. They've harnessed it to prevent things from changing. And that's happened with the school boards in many jurisdictions.
Good morning. What role do you believe state compulsory education laws play in supporting a system that we all believe is inefficient and inadequate?
Yeah, I know you've done a lot of work on that, and I don't have a well-formed view on compulsory education laws. I do have an instinct about the role of alternative schools and vouchers and parochial schools. I have a very short book coming out in a few months called Everyday Freedom, where I argue, among other things, that we have to give much more authority to localities and to churches and other organizations to perform public services, and we have to support them, not avoid them. I know we're going to be talking about it on a panel here later this morning. I just wish I were smarter on the subject, but I don't. But I mean, I believe in education, and so and I believe that the kids are being basically destroyed by the current system. So any alternative to that is good.
Great, thank you for the talk, and especially thank you for identifying fiduciary duties as public officials' duties and the Republican Guarantee Clause, and the Federalist Society authors, including Robert Nadelson and others, have focused a lot on the nature of fiduciary duties as public officers. My main question was the space for federalism when we talk about the role of the federal Constitution and states, the traditional states' role in education. One concern is that it's not just the federal Congress and the federal executive branch that are overstepping the role of states. And now we also have a concern about the federal Supreme Court. And if the revival of the Republican Guarantee Clause then treads on, let's say, the 10th Amendment and questions of states, the role of states, that's a concern. But I did want to follow up on the first question, because on the aspect of the non-delegation doctrine and the overlap of ceding or delegating to private parties, Schechter Poultry is really about delegating rulemaking to private organizations. If you can give an example of how states have delegated not just a role of contracts, let's say building roads or private prisons or in education, that there is this functional role, but that they've delegated rulemaking authority
Right.
to education.
Yeah, well,
unions.
that's a very good point. I mean, in many ways, they have delegated, rulemaking authority to the unions. You can't do, under these contracts, again, there's a disagreement. It gets resolved by somebody who's not elected. An unelected arbitrator. It's really phenomenal. In New York, there's something called the Triborough Amendment that says if the elected executive doesn't agree with the proposed collective bargaining agreement, the existing agreement stays in place indefinitely with all cost of living adjustments built in, continuing to operate. So you have a system that really is rigged, for the unions. And I think the guarantee clause, I think the problem identified is squarely addressed by the guarantee clause. Lawyers have encouraged me to bring state law actions. The state courts the Illinois state court comes to mind, are not receptive to these arguments. They too have been elected or appointed with the support of unions. This is the spoil system. And everybody in the system is beholden to it. So in my view, it only has a federal judicial solution. And it's a constitutional solution. And I'm a practical guy. I don't think of everything in terms of federalism. I just want to solve problems. This particular problem, I think, can only be solved at the level I'm talking about. Yes, ma'am.
Good morning. Thank you so much. I have a question here. They're not as fancy, high-end as the others, but a couple of them. One, I appreciate everything you said, and would it not maybe be better instead of referring to them as public employees, because that kicks in a whole number of things, but they are actually public servants, and it's a leadership issue.
Right.
I'm prior military. I am just constantly perplexed that people don't know the fundamental nature of their job and their authority. Do you see the same tactic that you're arguing here? I see it going across not just education, but do you see in other areas of government that this same guarantee clause argument could be made to say, hey, you can't outsource military conduct at the battlefield. You can't outsource
Right.
health decisions. Thank
Right, yeah, absolutely. And the book is not just about teachers' unions. I mean, teachers' unions happen to be the most influential of all the unions. I mean, 10% of the delegates at a typical Democratic National Convention are members of the teachers' union. I mean, so I talk about all the other public unions as well. It's hard to kind of overestimate the relentlessness of the unions. In 2021, the New York State Legislature passed 24 bills to sweeten pensions and benefits to public union members. In a state like most states that is reeling from the excessive cost of public union benefits. They passed 21. So think of the power of it. Think of that relentlessness that's machined $5 billion a year in dues, and people hammering, pushing the system constantly, going on year after year for 50-some years. That's what we're in, and with no counter force. Nobody else organized like this. So yeah, the operating machinery of government, which is the responsibility of elected executives, is no longer in the executive's control.
So I know we're running out of time, so I'll make this real quick. But so I was the school board president in my community for several years. I was the first school board president in probably 30 years or more to actually say no to the unions. Right. And we made some real significant changes. But then, of course, they immediately got someone a former union president to run against me, and the power of the union, they replaced me. But so I've experienced some of the exact things you're talking about. And I got your book. I read it. For everybody else, it's an easy read. It says a lot of what you're saying, puts more detail in it. One of the questions, though, I had in here was looking at the end notes. I didn't see that there were any law review articles that address any of these issues. Are you aware if there are any? Have you looked for that? Or I'm guessing they're sparse if there are.
Well, as Bob suggested in its opening remarks, maybe I'm slightly more original than other legal thinkers. I have a kind of a kind of unusual relationship with the legal academy. That's a way of saying it. Harvard Law School just did a written symposium on this book with 4 distinguished constitutional scholars, all trying to pick apart my arguments. But they all basically said, and it's available, online or whatever, that, well, they're not sure. The guarantee clause hasn't been interpreted this way yet, although it's a real problem and it needs to be identified. It's like an academic, sort of thing like that. I was an appellate lawyer. I didn't do public policy. I did, securities and antitrust cases and that sort of thing. So I didn't do this kind of law, but I did do appellate law. And the cases that I'm best known for, including Chris Kraft's case in the Supreme Court and the Kodak antitrust cases and others, were all cases in which the arguments I made were directly contrary to the accepted wisdom of the academy and of all the experts. Louis Loss, a securities expert at Harvard, said we could not make the argument that we won in the Supreme Court on the Chris Kraft case. I got a case challenging what the R.J. Nabisco buyout had done to the bondholders, MetLife and others. I got the case at a small law firm because no respectable law firm in New York would take the case. They said, you have no basis for challenging what you've done to the bondholders. I said, this is wrong. You've completely screwed these bondholders by this. You've given away what you promised. They promised they'd be investment-grade bonds, and then they gave away the security, so they became junk bonds. You can't do that. I didn't know at that point what the theory was. I won the case. So this is a situation, forget about what the law is and what the academy is generally within its own fences. Everybody's arguing about what's inside the walls. This is a problem that doesn't fit, I said that, within those walls. But the facts are unimpeachable. You can't lose this case on the facts. Democracy can't work if the people we elect have no meaningful authority over the operating machinery of government. A school can't be fixed. Okay, well, we supposedly live in a democracy, so what's the solution? Well, there's no clear constitutional avenue. No one's written about it. There is a history of the guarantee clause, which I commend to you, written 50 years ago by William Wiechek, which I refer to in the book, and I've read all the cases. I've read, hundreds of Supreme Court cases on executive authority and all this kind of stuff, all the guarantee clause cases. So it's going to require a move forward in constitutional law. But democracy can't work unless we do it. So the case doesn't scare me at all. It's right. Why wouldn't the Supreme Court do this? Read their opinions in Janus and such. They understand what the unions are doing. So we just need to construct something that makes sense. And I see Dean Reuter over there. He's going to help me do it. So
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't know if we have time. Do we have time for one more? Okay, one more.
You mentioned it's a constitutional issue and that elected officials should sue for their rights back. Is there room on the federal level to do that, or Congress to do it, or is it mostly at the state level?
Well, I was talking to Eugene Scalia about this yesterday, and there actually is a lot that Congress could do here. There are many ways to address this problem. I've only thought of a couple, but they include conditions for that could be imposed by Congress on, I don't know, federal aid or other things. I mean, there are lots of there could be conditions on political activity by public employees or the conflict of interest. That could be legislated, sort of like the Hatch Act. So sure, there's room for a lot of innovative thinking here, and I've tried to open a door to a way of looking at this and tethered it to democratic governance, it has to work, right? But that's the point of democracy. It has to have some basis on which we can actually elect people to solve these problems. So I think there are a lot of ways to skin the cat, and I look forward to working with some of you and figuring out more of those ways.
Thank you.
Thanks again.